How did a theft by a Dutchman in the 1500s lead to not only the world's first publicly traded company and the first stock exchange, but also the largest multinational company ever? By the end of this episode, we'll have covered that. Sure, an argument can be made that the Romans had limited forms of this, but it was in the Netherlands that the template for the modern stock exchanges and publicly traded companies like Facebook or Apple that we recognize today started. To start to answer this question, we're going to need to go back to the Netherlands of the late 1500s. Look at the Netherlands on a map now, and you see a very small country. I mean, barely a speck on the map. Ask people what they know about the Dutch, and you're going to get the typical stereotype responses. Tulips, windmills, Delftware, wooden shoes, liberal attitudes, and possibly social net. Dig a bit deeper, and you will find people who know about the Dutch relationship with water and land beyond the typical finger and dike jokes. But dig still deeper, and Dutch history, with all its seeming contradictions, begins to reveal itself. Take the first contradiction. Many are aware of American Commodore Perry, how he opened up trade between Japan and the Western world for the first time in 200 years back in the mid-1800s. What often is not mentioned, though, is that the Dutch for those 200 years were an exception and did trade with Japan, and in doing so would make many cultural swaps, a few of which we'll mention later. For much of the mid to late 1500s, the Netherlands was engaged in a bitter 80-year war with Spain. But in 1581, they ousted Habsburg armies in the northern portion of the Netherlands, where they established the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. Having ousted King Philip II's Spanish troops, they rejigged a position known in English as the stadtholder or steward, a position which generally was a leadership position in absentia of a royal figure. However, for the new republic, it was now the top position, and most critically, beholden to no monarchy. By today's standards, we could certainly nitpick the freedom they had, but for the day, it was a bastion of religious tolerance and freedom. Jews and Huguenots among those who flocked to the Republic in their thousands, and as a result, art and the middle class flourished. A middle class that, thanks to land scarcity then as now, looked to other forms of investments like trade. This was the environment that ushered in the Dutch Golden Age of the 1600s. We'll get back to this in a minute. We still need to discuss the economic fuel that would be needed to drive all of this forward. To get to the kindling of that economic fuel, we go back to the early years of the New Republic in the late 1500s, where we find Jan Huygens van Linschoten, who we'll just call John. John left the Netherlands to join his brother in a trade venture in Spain, and when that folded after a few years, his brother found yet another opportunity, this time in Portugal. John sailed with the Portuguese, who had for almost all of the 1500s enjoyed a virtual monopoly on East Indies trade. The Portuguese ships powered by religious and political fervor, with trade as a nice side benefit. They held the key to that monopoly in the form of knowledge of the geography and navigation required to traverse that geography, which they had placed on maps that were guarded as closely as national secrets. John and the Portuguese crew, which included his sponsor, the Archbishop of Goa, sailed east and visited multiple locations, including the Archbishop's namesake Goa on India's coast. In a slimy bit of theft, John betrayed the trust of his Portuguese handlers and the Archbishop by making copies of the secretive nautical charts, and appended those copies with his own notes gleaned from conversations with the Portuguese and locals during his travels. When his appointment ended after the death of the Archbishop, he returned to the Republic and published 2 books. Each of those books was in turn published in both English and Dutch. These books changed everything for both England and the Netherlands, since they represented a literal blueprint for dismantling Portugal's monopoly on Eastern trade. Which leads to another bit of contradiction for the seemingly very social Netherlands. A founding driven by ambitious, albeit ruthless at times, capitalism. The English beat the Dutch in the formation of an East India Company in 1600 by just 2 years. However, the Dutch East India Company, which we will refer to by its acronym VOC, was fueled not by royal decree, political, or religious fervor. It was to be fueled solely by its investors. Those investors, the growing middle class that had been flourishing in the Republic's tolerant, open, and diverse atmosphere. The majority of middle class and its merchants opted to forgo real estate investment in favor of Eastern trade. This investment led to the VOC being formed and given a monopoly by the government, becoming the first public company to release an initial public offering. As a result, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was formed to deal with the printed stocks and bonds. Millions of guilders' capital via issued shares was raised to fund the boats, crews, and goods going to the East Indies. The shares would, from 1602 to 1696, pay a regular dividend that yielded between 12 and 63%. The VOC had the largest market capital adjusted for inflation of any company ever in the history of the world, at over $7 trillion. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 10 times the size of Apple. And thanks to their mastery of the wind via a land armada of windmills that dotted the countryside and cities, the ships could be manufactured in a third the time it took other nations. At its height, the VOC boasted 40 warships, 150 trading vessels, and 10,000 professional soldiers, in addition to its many, many employees. Not all was rosy, though. While religion and royal decree didn't play as big a role in their company, the Dutch thirst for profits meant the means they employed to secure those profits didn't always benefit their trade partners equally. Dutch conduct was at times atrocious in the East Indies region of Indonesia, for example. Also, the means of recruiting seamen to work the VOC ships was most often a dark and sinister affair. We will cover the experience of one such seaman in the next Your History Story series. However, despite the darker aspects, the VOC enjoyed some perks not available to the other European nations. For example, the Japanese leadership, which reacted harshly to the continued Portuguese attempts to proselytize its people. To counter these conversions, they first banned their citizens from traveling overseas and then forbade Portugal and almost all countries from trade with Japan. However, there were benefits to trade, and that same Japanese leadership had developed a taste for it, so 2 countries were exempt from the ban. The first was China, and the second was the Netherlands, whom they knew had never shown inclination to proselytize. The Dutch thirst for trade profits like Star Trek's Ferengi would ensure this arrangement would last for the remainder of the VOC's existence. During that time, the Dutch introduced Western medicine and beer to Japan, and Japan, its style of porcelain that would, among other influences, evolve into Delftware blue. So the next time you drink a beer in Japan, or purchase some porcelain in Delft, think of this, the genesis. Shortly after becoming nationalized in 1796, the VOC dissolved on the last day of December in 1799. Indonesia, which had become a colony, received its independence shortly after World War II. And in Japan, you can visit a modern recreation of the island town that the Dutch traded out of for those 200 years. Thanks to John's 1500s version of cyber thieving, we today can enjoy a vast array of products and services offered by public companies.